instantly claiming central territory and opening diagonals for bishops. Embracing asymmetry, this Sicilian defense immediately injects positional complexity and offers counterplay on the queen side. Developing this knight immediately challenges black's central pawn and prepares for swift development, seizing the initiative. Bolstering the center and preparing for the Sicilians' characteristic pawn battles, d6 immediately confronts the knight's central influence. Directing the bishop toward the vulnerable f7 square immediately increases pressure on black's kingside. Developing a knight to challenge white's central pawn and prepare for kingside castling is a standard and solid response. Solidifying the center's pawn structure prepares for a comfortable queenside buildup and avoids early pawn weaknesses. Solidifying the center and preparing to develop the bishop gives black a robust structure. Securing the monarch initiates a period of positional development, preparing for central pawn advances and unified piece action. Developing the bishop to this square solidifies the kingside and prepares for castling, a crucial step in safeguarding the monarch. Safeguarding the king with the rook, this prepares for potential pawn pushes or simply bolsters the central defense, setting up a flexible position where white can later activate the rook to a more central file, perhaps even the d-file after further development. Instantly securing the monarch removes any immediate threats and prepares for central engagement, a wise precaution before committing forces to the pawn structure. Building a solid pawn chain anchors the center and prepares for a future queenside expansion, aiming to gain space and restrict black's bishop. Challenging the center, this pawn thrust immediately seeks to break open the position and create dynamic play, potentially liberating black's pieces. Reclaiming space on the queen side, this retreat offers a sanctuary for the bishop, anticipating a potential a6 and b5 pawn push while simultaneously preparing to contest the crucial central files. Opening up a fascinating strategic battle, black immediately confronts white's ambitious bishop, forcing a crucial decision and contesting the center's territory, potentially limiting white's queenside expansion while creating new weaknesses in black's own structure. Opening the central diagonal for the queen and rook, this capture immediately disrupts black's pawn chain, creating dynamic imbalances and forcing a reevaluation of black's king's safety. Opening up the d-file for your rook now creates fascinating diagonal possibilities for your bishop on e7, forcing white to reconsider their central pawn structure's stability. Eliminating queens now drastically accelerates the endgame, turning a complex middle game into a straightforward battle for material advantage and piece activity, where understanding pawn structure weaknesses becomes paramount. Recapturing the queen opens a central file, a critical pathway for future action. This exchange, though seemingly simple, fundamentally alters the board's dynamics, allowing for increased mobility and potential pressure along the now cleared d-file for black's rook. The structural damage dealt to white's pawn chain by the earlier capture creates a subtle yet exploitable weakness. Recapturing the pawn with the knight strategically redirects its influence toward the center, aiming to bolster white's pawn structure and prepare for future central advances or skirmishes. The knight hops to a6, a curious repositioning that aims to outflank the queenside and potentially support an eventual b5 pawn push, though it temporarily abandons central influence and neglects development of the queenside bishop, creating a potential weakness on the long dark square diagonal if white can exploit it. Reclaiming the central pawn immediately sharpens the position, aiming to exploit black's slight awkwardness on the queenside where the knight on a6 lacks immediate influence and the pawn structure is somewhat fractured. White seeks to leverage this temporary imbalance by activating pieces towards the center and potentially creating threats on the kingside. A bold recapture, instantly centralizing a knight and potentially igniting counterplay on the queenside squares, now left somewhat vulnerable to further incursions. Reactivating the rook along the open file is crucial for asserting dominance. It now eyes the potential pawn weakness on c4 and prepares to support future central advances, while also offering a subtle threat of doubling on the d-file should black fail to address the newfound pressure. The knight lands on a pivotal square, immediately challenging the central control white has meticulously built. The rook's repositioning to the central file aims to reclaim central control and prepare for potential operations along the e-file, which has been cleared of its immediate defenders. Suddenly, the knight infiltrates deep into enemy territory, a daring raid that promises to disrupt white's harmony. This foray to d3 creates immediate threats to the kingside pawn structure and could potentially force concessions or a serious repositioning of white's pieces. Observe how this centralized knight now dictates terms, eyeing potential targets and creating tactical possibilities that were previously non-existent. It's a bold statement, aiming to exploit the slightly less defended squares around the white king. Rerouting the rook to a more active file, preparing to contest the open c-file and potentially support an advance on the queen side. Securing the bishop's diagonal with b6 prepares to activate the queenside minority, potentially challenging white's central control and creating queenside play. Reclaiming the bishop's original outpost initiates a subtle reshuffling of white's pieces, aiming to improve their placement after black's aggressive pawn push. The bishop's repositioning prepares for future activity, potentially eyeing the queenside or reinforcing the center. This subtle retreat prevents the bishop from becoming a passive observer on the a1h8 diagonal, seeking more dynamic squares. Strategically, white is consolidating their position, aiming to connect their rooks more effectively and potentially prepare a central break. The move sets the stage for a potential pawn lever on the queen side, creating new avenues for white's pieces. By returning the bishop to c2, white aims to untangle their pieces and build a more cohesive attacking structure. This maneuver could be a prelude to repositioning the knight, creating a more formidable attacking formation. The bishop's return seeks to improve its defensive capabilities, while remaining ready to participate in offensive operations. White is clearly prioritizing piece harmony, bringing the bishop to a square where it can coordinate better with the rest of the army. A quiet yet purposeful repositioning, white seeks to activate dormant pieces and create opportunities for tactical skirmishes. Seizing the open c-file with the knight creates immediate pressure, disrupting white's pawn structure and opening avenues for black's rooks. This aggressive pawn grab, however, potentially weakens the dark squares around black's own king in the long run, a trade-off that demands careful positional awareness moving forward. Reclaiming the open file is paramount, immediately challenging black's control and preparing to contest the c-file. Developing the bishop to the long diagonal aims to pressure white's king's safety and contest the c4 square, potentially preparing for a future b5 push. The white king ventures out from its protective pawn shield, seeking a more active role in the ensuing endgame. This decision, while potentially bringing the king closer to the center of action, also exposes it to potential threats if black can consolidate their pieces effectively. The newly opened c-file beckons the rook, preparing to contest its control and bring the remaining minor piece into a more active role. Attempting to pry open the queenside pawns, 19. b3 aims to create weaknesses for black's structure, but it might also provide black's rook on c8 a more inviting path to a central infiltration. Consider how this pawn push alters the long-term control of the queenside diagonal and whether it forces black into a reactive posture or grants them new attacking avenues. The bishop seeks a more active diagonal, preparing to harass white's kingside pawn structure while eyeing the open c-file's potential. Asserting dominance on the queen side, this pawn push aims to restrict black's bishop and prepare for potential breakthroughs. Unlocking potential on the queen side, this pawn push initiates a structural realignment, aiming to secure a foothold and challenge white's control over the file. It anticipates a future advance, preparing to contest the open lines and potentially create counterplay, while carefully considering the pawn chain's long-term integrity. Reasserting pressure on the open c-file, the rook now eyes the pawn on c4, aiming to dislodge black's advanced knight and potentially force a concession on the queen side. Initiating a rook maneuver to secure the c-file, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially create doubled pawns or gain active play along the newly opened vertical. Clearing the path for the rook to become more active, This repositioning aims to contest the d-file and potentially disrupt black's connected passed pawns. The rook exchange on the d-file dramatically simplifies the position, ushering in an endgame where black aims to leverage the bishop pair and pawn structure. The rook's journey to d1, now cemented by its bishop's support, aims to reclaim its central presence and prepare for potential pawn advances on the queen side, eyeing the vulnerable a5 square. Suddenly, the bishop finds a much more active diagonal, aiming straight at the queen side and potentially creating pressure on the pawn structure. Reclaiming the central outpost for the bishop, white seeks to re-establish a more active diagonal, aiming to contest the open files and potentially restrict black's bishop on b7. Shifting the bishop to its new perch allows black to eye white's d3 square, subtly preparing to contest the center and potentially create weaknesses around the king. Solidifying the pawn structure and preparing for potential breakthroughs, this maneuver cleverly repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the king side and aiming to disrupt black's control over the d-file. The rook now anchors itself on the open c-file, contesting this vital corridor and preparing to support a potential pawn advance or a future infiltration into white's territory. Solidifying pawn structure and preparing to advance the kingside majority, though it does create a slight weakness on e3 that might be exploited later. Securing the king's safety remains paramount, allowing for freer piece development and a more robust defensive structure against any potential pawn advances on the kingside. Reclaiming the vital c-file with the rook hints at a desire to challenge black's pawn structure, aiming to dismantle their central stronghold and perhaps create weaknesses on the queen side. The bishop retreats to a square where it supports the rook on c8 and potentially eye the d3 pawn, while also preparing to reposition itself to a more active diagonal if the opportunity arises. Securing that central outpost for the bishop, aiming to control the important diagonals leading towards black's king and create pressure on the c6 pawn, is a solid positional adjustment. Recentering the bishop to the less active edge of the board after its initial foray offers a more stable defensive posture, preparing to support the pawn structure and await developments from white's rook on the open file. Initiating a central pawn push here, nd2***, aims to free up the knight and prepare for potential central pawn advancement, seeking to unclog white's position and potentially create dynamic play. Consolidating the monarch towards the center is a sound strategic decision now that the queens are gone, preparing the king for potential middle game skirmishes and securing it against any lingering tactical threats from the rooks. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside, f4 aims to pry open lines and activate the g2 bishop, potentially creating immediate threats against black's relatively safe monarch. Solidifying the pawn structure on the kingside, this move prevents any immediate incursions by white's pieces towards the king and prepares for potential pawn advances later in the game. Initiating a knight repositioning from the slightly cramped central post towards the queen side, this maneuver aims to enhance piece activity and potentially exploit weaknesses along the file or in black's pawn structure. It's a subtle bid to improve white's strategic influence, hinting at a future push or regrouping that could surprise the opponent. Embarking on a pawn storm like this, especially when your king still has an exposed flank, risks creating weaknesses that the opponent can exploit later. Pioneering this pawn thrust opens lines for the rook on the g-file, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses around black's king and create dynamic play. Injecting dynamism into the center with the rook aims to activate black's pieces and challenge white's slightly static structure. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside can be a double-edged sword, and white's monarch now finds itself exposed to potential pawn advances from black's king and f-pawn. Unleashing the pawn chain's potential by fracturing white's defensive structure around the king is a bold gambit, creating immediate attacking possibilities down the g-file and potentially weakening the king's safety as the game progresses towards a less defended territory. Capturing the pawn opens the g-file, directly confronting black's king and creating immediate tactical possibilities down that newly liberated column. Unlocking the bishop's potential hinges on this repositioning, It aims to create a more active diagonal for the dark-squared bishop, potentially supporting a central pawn push or offering support for future piece activity on the queen side. A daring knight sortie, rerouting the steed to a central outpost, threatening to disrupt the opponent's pawn structure and create discomfort on the king side. Unleashing the rook to the open g-file, this aggressive maneuver aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances against the white king, aiming to exploit any overextension or weakness that might arise from white's pawn push on the king side. Unlocking the d-file for the rook immediately presents offensive possibilities. Sacrificing the bishop here clears black's central pawn structure, potentially opening lines for the rook and king to become more active in the ensuing endgame. Opening the f-file grants the rook an immediate avenue for activity, though it also potentially exposes the king's pawn shield later. Reclaiming the open file and preparing for a potential pawn storm on the king side, the rook's aggressive repositioning initiates a dynamic shift, eyeing key squares and forcing white to reassess their defensive structure. Securing the king's safety is paramount, and repositioning to the more central g3 square offers better protection from potential pawn pushes and the lurking rook on the g-file. Reclaiming the pawn with the rook on e5 opens up the e-file, a significant development that could influence the endgame's dynamism. Pushing the h-pawn now grants crucial breathing room for your monarch, creating an escape square and a vital barrier against potential pawn storms or infiltrations along the king side. This rook's repositioning is a clever attempt to disrupt white's control of the d-file and potentially set up counterplay on the queen side, but it leaves the king side pawn structure vulnerable to a knight sortie. The white king ventures out, a bold, potentially risky maneuver to join the central fray, aiming to support the f-pawn's advance and perhaps exploit the open files. The rook's retreat to the 8th rank aims to consolidate the pawn structure and prepare for a potential advance on the king side, though it might leave the g-file slightly vulnerable to white's active pieces. Securing the bishop on f3 opens up potential diagonals for attack and prepares for a more active role in the center, while simultaneously limiting black's king's escape routes should the pawn structure loosen further. Unleashing a forceful check, black's rook now traverses the open king's file, aiming to disrupt white's somewhat exposed monarch and potentially create tactical opportunities down this crucial vertical. This king's relocation to the center signals a bold gambit for active participation, intending to seize the initiative from the opponent's rather passive rook by forcing it to retreat. Securing the king with a pawn advance is a sensible defensive measure, preventing immediate checks while also preparing to potentially expand black's queenside pawn structure if an opportunity arises. Shifting the king towards the center is crucial for controlling the d-file and preparing for potential pawn advances, aiming to consolidate and potentially create a passed pawn down the line. Shifting the rook to the king side offers improved attacking potential, aiming to exploit any weaknesses that arise from white's centralized king and potentially weak pawns. The king, emboldened by its central location, marches forward to support the pawns and potentially participate in the queenside defense. Suddenly, the rook on h3 becomes a serious threat, a shadow cast over white's kingside where the monarch is already feeling quite exposed. A bold repositioning of the bishop aims to disrupt black's pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses on the queenside while simultaneously seeking more active diagonals. Seizing the initiative with a bold pawn thrust, black immediately challenges white's centralized king and opens diagonal pathways, aiming to exploit any lingering weaknesses in white's position. Stepping into the advanced endgame, this audacious king advance seeks to exploit the potential instability of black's pawns on the queenside and grab central space, before black can consolidate their queenside activity. Snatching that pawn immediately ignites the attack, opening a pathway directly towards the exposed monarch and creating an immediate crisis that white cannot afford to ignore. King now exposed in the center, a risky gambit to potentially break through black's advancing pawn chain. Sacrificing the pawn on the h-file opens a dangerous diagonal for your rook and presents a critical test for white's monarch. exploiting the weakened queenside pawn structure. This maneuver aims to create immediate counterplay and open lines for the rook. Seizing the open files here is a bold choice, but it might be premature, as it offers no immediate defensive support to your pawns on the queenside. Initiating pawn capture on the queenside aims to create a passed pawn or force a favorable exchange, yet it might open the b-file for black's rook and potentially expose the white king if not handled carefully. Pawning that island center is a bold gambit, opening a diagonal for your king to potentially escape or advance later, but it does leave your queenside pawns isolated and potentially vulnerable to attack from the white rook and knight. Seizing the open c-file offers immediate pressure, threatening to penetrate white's position and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure. Seizing that open diagonal with the bishop creates immediate pressure, potentially targeting weaknesses on white's kingside and forcing them to dedicate resources to defense. Unlocking the c-file for your rook, the aim is to challenge black's advanced pawn and perhaps open lines towards their weakened king, a critical shift in focus towards the critical queenside action. That check is a calculated attempt to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and create some breathing room for the black rooks, hoping to exploit the awkward placement of the white king. Stepping into the danger zone, the king abandons its protective pawn shield, aiming to influence the critical central squares and prepare for potential pawn breakthroughs or support any advancing pieces. The pawn push, a4, unlocks a dynamic of queenside play, forcing white to confront a potential passed pawn or commit a piece to its defense, simultaneously opening avenues for black's rooks to become more active along the now accessible files. Unleashing a decisive check, white forces a critical decision on black's king, immediately disrupting any hope of a stable defensive setup and aiming to exploit the exposed black monarch. Suddenly, a stark vulnerability emerges on the queenside as black neglects reinforcement for the exposed c4 square, potentially inviting a devastating pawn push and creating structural weaknesses that could unravel the entire position. King venturing into the enemy's territory, this maneuver aims to exploit the unprotected pawn on a4 and disrupt black's queenside structure, potentially opening lines for a decisive assault. The king ventures into an increasingly exposed position, seeking respite from the storm of open lines, but the pawn structure remains a precarious foundation. Harnessing the open diagonals, the rook now prepares to sweep across the back rank, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and create mating threats against the exposed king. The unassuming placing of that pawn on a3 is a crucial step in preparing the queenside breakthrough, aiming to finally activate the otherwise passive rook on a4 and potentially create a dangerous passed pawn. Seizing the open file with the pawn offers a dangerous infiltration route, threatening to cut off black's bishop and potentially break through the queenside pawns. Unleashing a pawn to its final destination, this pawn promotion threat forces white into immediate and difficult calculations to prevent a new queen. Securing the promotion square becomes paramount as the queen's pawn marches forward, directly challenging the bishop's positional dominance and preparing to disrupt black's pawn structure. Sacrificing the bishop to create a passed pawn, black aims to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and introduce a dynamic element into the endgame. This move creates a dangerous battery on the c-file, aiming to trap black's bishop and potentially open lines for white's rooks. Navigating towards the center, the king aims to consolidate its position and potentially support pawn advances in the late stages of this complex endgame. The bishop's repositioning here is a subtle attempt to wrestle control of the crucial c-file, aiming to cut off the black rook's mobility and prepare a potential advance of the c-pawn if the opportunity arises, all while keeping a watchful eye on the d7 bishop. Unleashing the pawn's potential creates a dynamic imbalance, forcing the opponent to actively defend against immediate threats and potentially opening avenues for further penetration.